Welcome to the channel. Today, we dive deep into a haunting and true story, the dark legacy of morphine and how it shaped medicine, addiction, and lives for over a century. If you're fascinated by real historical mysteries and want to explore stories that blend science, society, and human struggle, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's unravel this gripping tale together. In the middle of the 19th century, pain was not an abstract idea. It was visible, audible, smelled of blood, sweat, and infection. Hospitals were loud places, not with machines, but with human voices. Screams during amputations, groans that lasted for days. Soldiers returning from wars with shattered bones and shattered minds. Women giving birth without anesthesia. Children coughing themselves to death. Doctors had almost nothing to offer. Opium had existed for centuries, but it was crude, unpredictable, and dangerous. Dosage was guesswork. Relief came with delirium. Death often followed. Then, in 1804, a quiet breakthrough occurred in Germany. A young pharmacist, Friedrich Turner, isolated a single compound from opium, something pure, stronger, and measurable. He named it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. At first, no one paid much attention. But by the 1840s, the world was ready. The real transformation came with two inventions that would never be separated again: morphine and the hypodermic needle. By the 1850s, doctors could finally do something revolutionary: inject relief directly into the bloodstream. No waiting. No guessing. No screaming. For the first time in medical history, pain could be turned off. Surgeons described it as miraculous. Patients described it as peace. Medical journals called morphine a gift to mankind. And why wouldn't they? It worked fast. It worked reliably. It worked where nothing else did. Morphine dulled battlefield agony. Morphine calmed childbirth. Morphine soothed chronic illness, injury, grief. In an era obsessed with progress, this felt like proof that science was winning. By the time of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, morphine was everywhere. Tens of thousands of soldiers were injected after surgery. Field doctors carried it as essential equipment. Pain was no longer something to be endured, it was something to be erased. But war has a way of revealing the hidden costs of innovation. Many soldiers returned home healed, at least on the surface. They slept better. They felt calmer. They asked for more. Doctors noticed something strange but didn't yet have the language for it. Patients weren't just avoiding pain. They were avoiding absence. Without morphine, something felt missing. A weight returned. A restlessness. A quiet panic. Physicians called it soldier's disease. They did not call it addiction. Not yet. Outside hospitals, morphine began to escape the controlled world of medicine. By the late 19th century, it appeared in cough syrups, women's tonics, nerve remedies, sleep aids, postpartum treatments. It was sold legally, advertised openly, prescribed generously, especially to women. Doctors believed women were biologically fragile, prone to hysteria, anxiety, emotional imbalance. Morphine, they said, was gentle, safe, appropriate. It was not associated with vice. That stigma belonged to opium dens and the poor. Morphine, by contrast, was clean, scientific, modern. It came in small glass vials with precise labels. It came with trust. By the 1890s, something uncomfortable became harder to ignore. Patients needed higher doses. Relief lasted shorter periods. Withdrawal produced sweating, shaking, terror, pain worse than the original illness. Doctors were confused. How could a medicine meant to end suffering now be causing so much of it? Some began to worry. Most did not. Because morphine still worked. And because admitting the truth would mean admitting something far more frightening. That modern medicine had not just failed to control pain. It had created a new one. And it was spreading quietly, prescription by prescription, needle by needle. Not as a crime. Not as a scandal. But as a cure. Medical journals began to change their language. Where once there were warnings and cautions, now there was admiration. Morphine was described as precise, reliable, humane. By the 1850s and 1860s, it spread quietly through hospitals in Europe and the United States, carried not by addicts or criminals, but by doctors in clean coats, by nurses with steady hands. It was administered before amputations, before childbirth, before dental work, before death. Pain, once feared as inevitable, now seemed optional. And morphine did something opium never could. It felt modern. Measured doses. Clear solutions. Predictable results. Science, finally, appeared to have control. Then came the wars. The American Civil War flooded hospitals with broken bodies, shattered bones, torn flesh, infections creeping through wounds faster than surgeons could cut. Morphine became salvation. Crates of it followed the armies. Syringes lay beside bandages. Doctors injected it without hesitation, sometimes several times a day. Soldiers called it God's mercy. Some called it the quiet hour. Others never learned its name at all. They only knew that when it entered their veins, the noise stopped. The screams faded. The shaking slowed. The memories loosened their grip. When the war ended, the men went home. They carried medals. They carried scars. And many of them carried a small, invisible need they could not yet name. Doctors noticed it only slowly. Patients returning again and again, not for pain that could be seen, but for pain that could not. A vague restlessness. Anxiety. Sleeplessness. Morphine was prescribed generously. It always had been. No one called it addiction. Not yet. To the medical world, morphine was still a triumph. A symbol that suffering could be controlled. What they did not yet understand was that control had quietly changed sides. By the late 1850s, morphine was no longer a curiosity whispered about in medical journals. It had a name. It had a dose. And it had a promise. In 1853, the invention of the hypodermic needle changed everything. What had once been swallowed slowly, bitter on the tongue, now slipped directly into the bloodstream, clean, precise, almost elegant. Doctors spoke of control. Of science finally mastering pain instead of merely dulling it. Morphine was no longer just a drug. It was a tool. Hospitals across Europe and the United States adopted it with quiet confidence. Surgeons praised it. Physicians prescribed it freely. There were no warning labels, no dosage limits that carried fear. Pain, after all, was considered the true enemy, and morphine defeated it instantly. Then came the war. During the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, morphine flowed as freely as blood. Field hospitals reeked of iron, sweat, and antiseptic. Limbs were amputated by lantern light. Screams cut through canvas tents. And everywhere, there was morphine. It silenced agony in seconds. It steadied shaking hands. It allowed men to survive wounds that would have killed them a generation earlier. Doctors injected without hesitation. They had no time to count doses. No time to observe long-term effects. Survival today mattered more than consequences tomorrow. When the war ended, tens of thousands of soldiers went home alive. And many of them carried something unseen with them. At first, it looked like recovery. A former soldier takes a small injection at night to help him sleep. A widow uses it for nervous pains. A mother is prescribed morphine drops for exhaustion and melancholy, a common diagnosis for women in the late 19th century. The drug had begun to slip out of hospitals and into homes. Pharmaceutical companies noticed. By the 1870s, morphine was being sold openly, as syrups, powders, tablets, and injectable solutions. Advertisements promise relief from coughs, migraines, menstrual pain, anxiety, insomnia. Some products were marketed specifically to women, described as gentle, refined, safe. Doctors reassured patients with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Morphine is not addictive when used medicinally. They truly believed it. But quietly, something else was happening. Patients began returning sooner than expected, asking for stronger doses, claiming the pain had changed, deepened, become harder to reach. Some physicians noticed and ignored it. Others noticed and blamed the patients. Weakness, moral failure, poor constitution. No one wanted to believe the truth, that the miracle had teeth, and it was already sinking them in. By the 1880s, the word addiction still carried no clear medical meaning. What doctors saw instead was inconvenience. Patients who could not stop. Patients who exaggerated pain. Patients who became difficult. Morphine dependence was not yet viewed as a disease, but as a flaw, a weakness of will. And weakness, in the logic of the era, belonged to the patient, never the prescription. Middle-class homes hid it carefully. A woman keeps a small glass vial in her sewing drawer. She tells herself it is medicine. Her doctor calls it maintenance. She has followed his instructions for years now, though the dose is no longer written anywhere. She measures it by instinct, by how loudly her body protests when she waits too long. Her hands begin to tremble in the mornings. Her stomach tightens with a hollow, crawling sensation. Sleep becomes impossible without the drug. None of this alarms her physician. Women were expected to be fragile, nervous, prone to hysteria. Morphine fit neatly into that narrative, a chemical calm for bodies society already believed were unstable. Meanwhile, pharmacists sold it without shame. In many American cities, morphine could be purchased without a prescription. No age limits. No records. It sat behind counters like any other remedy, its dangers invisible behind polished glass and neat labels. Medical journals debated dosage, purity, methods of injection. They did not debate whether morphine should be used at all. By the end of the century, doctors had begun to notice a pattern they could no longer fully ignore. Patients who had never known pain before treatment now could not live without it. Symptoms appeared when the drug was withdrawn: sweating, vomiting, panic, shaking, despair. Some patients begged. Others lied. A few stole. Still, the profession hesitated. To admit morphine was dangerous would mean admitting medicine itself had created the problem. So instead, a new idea emerged. The solution, they believed, was not less morphine, but something better, something cleaner, something safer, something that could replace it entirely. And in 1898, a German pharmaceutical company introduced a new drug to the world. They named it heroin. They promised it was non-addictive. And medicine, once again, believed. Heroin did not arrive as a warning. It arrived as an apology. Marketed as a gentler alternative to morphine, it was prescribed with confidence, even relief. Doctors welcomed it as proof that science was correcting its own mistakes. The drug was smoother, they said. Less habit-forming. More modern. In reality, it worked faster. And it gripped harder. Patients who switched from morphine to heroin often described the same sensation: a deeper calm, a fuller silence, a warmth that spread through the body like reassurance. For physicians exhausted by years of difficult patients, this felt like progress. By the early 1900s, heroin was being prescribed for coughs, tuberculosis, post-surgical pain, anxiety, even to help people quit morphine. The irony went unnoticed. What followed was not an explosion, but an accumulation. More patients. Younger patients. People with no medical history, no battlefield trauma, no chronic illness. They came back thinner, restless, unable to function without their dose. At the same time, something began to shift in public view. Newspapers started printing quiet warnings. Asylums reported rising admissions linked to drug habits. Coroners mentioned substances more often in their reports. Doctors could no longer pretend this was rare. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, requiring accurate labeling of medications. For the first time, many Americans learned that their tonics and syrups contained opiates. Some were shocked. Many were already dependent. Still, regulation moved slowly. The medical world resisted external control. Pharmaceutical companies lobbied. Physicians argued that restrictions would harm legitimate patients. Behind closed doors, however, a truth was taking shape. This was not about morality. Not about weak patients or careless individuals. It was systemic. Medicine had introduced a powerful substance into everyday life without understanding its cost, and then doubled down when the consequences appeared. By the time lawmakers began drafting serious narcotics legislation, the damage was no longer theoretical. An entire generation had learned to trust pain relief without question. And their bodies had learned something else entirely. That relief could demand a price. Paid daily. Increasingly. Without mercy. As the new century dawned, the world was waking up to an uncomfortable reality. The promise of healing had become a shadow. Women, men, and even children were quietly trapped in a cycle they barely understood. Radium, an invisible, deadly force, was not yet the enemy here, but the creeping grasp of morphine and heroin was already tightening. In small towns and bustling cities, families whispered about loved ones who seemed to vanish behind a veil of calm. Once vibrant, they became shadows of themselves, withdrawn, restless, desperate for the next dose. Hospitals struggled to confront the problem. Addiction was a word that carried stigma, but no treatment. Physicians felt trapped between their oath to heal and the harsh truth. Their most trusted medicines were creating new forms of suffering. Pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, continued to push their products, promising cures and comfort in elegant bottles. In this complex web of hope and despair, the line between salvation and destruction blurred. The very drugs meant to save lives were pulling them apart. And the nation stood at a crossroads, unsure which path to take next. The mounting crisis forced the medical community and lawmakers into action, though the response was slow and conflicted. In 1914, the United States enacted the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, the first federal law to regulate and tax the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and coca products. But this law was more about control than cure, aimed at restricting the supply while leaving thousands already dependent in a gray area of legality. For many, addiction was still a personal failing, not a medical condition. Treatment options were scarce and often cruel. Sanatoriums and asylums filled with patients struggling against the invisible chains of their dependence. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies quietly adjusted formulas, marketed non-addictive alternatives, and expanded their reach globally. The world was entering a new era, one where medicine's miracles would coexist with its darkest shadows. And the story of morphine, heroin, and addiction was far from over. The seeds planted in the 19th century had grown into a complex and haunting legacy, one that would shape medicine, law, and society for decades to come. As the 1920s unfolded, the aftermath of years of widespread morphine and heroin use became impossible to ignore. The faces behind the addiction were not the caricatures of criminals or outcasts. They were mothers, soldiers, doctors, and ordinary citizens, people whose lives had been irrevocably altered. Hospitals that once celebrated morphine as a wonder drug now faced an epidemic hidden in plain sight. Physicians wrestled with guilt and denial. Many refused to acknowledge their own roles in fostering dependency. The delicate balance between healing and harm had tipped. In homes across America, the struggle continued in silence. Patients guarded their secrets behind locked doors and hushed conversations. The physical withdrawal was brutal, pain unlike anything they had felt before, a torment that no medicine could erase. Some turned to the streets, seeking relief where medicine had failed. Others sank deeper into isolation and despair. Public awareness was growing slowly. Sensational stories appeared in newspapers, tales of addiction, ruin, and tragedy. But the narrative was incomplete. The cultural understanding of addiction lagged behind its reality. Lawmakers debated stricter regulations. Medical boards issued new guidelines. Pharmaceutical companies reformulated products, but profit still propelled supply. The 1920s marked a turning point, not just in legislation, but in the collective consciousness. Addiction was becoming recognized as a societal crisis. Yet, solutions remained elusive. The human toll was staggering. Hospitals reported rising numbers of patients suffering from morphine and heroin dependence, many of whom had been prescribed these drugs by trusted doctors. Stories surfaced of women who, under the guise of treating nervous conditions, had been given doses that chained them to their vials. Men who had fought wars only to return home enslaved by the very medicine meant to save them. Children born to addicted mothers faced uncertain futures. Despite growing evidence, stigma remained fierce. Addicts were blamed for their condition, painted as morally weak or flawed. Treatment was punitive, not compassionate. Rehabilitation centers, where they existed, were overcrowded and underfunded. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry continued to evolve. New drugs emerged, marketed as safer alternatives, but many carried risks just as severe. The cycle repeated itself. By the mid-1920s, awareness of the crisis inspired new voices. Doctors, journalists, and activists began demanding change, not only in laws but in attitudes. Scientific research advanced, uncovering the neurological and physiological complexities of addiction. Slowly, addiction began to be understood not as a failure of character, but as a disease. This shift was not without resistance. Medical institutions clung to old beliefs. Politicians hesitated to allocate resources. Society struggled to shed entrenched prejudices. Yet, the momentum for reform grew. Education campaigns spread awareness. Treatment methods improved, focusing on care rather than punishment. Still, the scars of decades of misuse lingered. Families torn apart. Lives lost. Trust broken. Morphine's legacy was a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how progress can mask peril. And as the world moved forward, the lessons of the past remained painfully relevant. The 1930s ushered in a new era of regulation and enforcement, but the shadow of addiction continued to lengthen. The 1937 Marijuana Tax Act and later the Controlled Substances Act reflected growing government attempts to control narcotics, yet these laws often focused more on punishment than on prevention or treatment. Addicts were increasingly criminalized. Hospitals and prisons became intertwined in managing those caught in the grip of addiction, with little distinction between illness and crime. Behind the scenes, research into addiction deepened. Scientists began to explore how morphine and heroin altered the brain's chemistry, understanding that dependence was not merely psychological but profoundly physical. Despite progress in science, public understanding lagged. Addiction remained cloaked in shame, making it difficult for many to seek help. Pharmaceutical companies, wary of regulation, cautiously adjusted their marketing strategies but continued to produce opiates for legitimate medical use. This duality, medicine and menace, persisted. Communities grappled with the fallout. Families fractured. Lives unraveled. And the people who had once trusted morphine as a miracle drug now faced its darkest consequences. During this decade, the stories of individuals caught in the opiate web became more visible. Newspapers printed harrowing accounts of families destroyed by addiction. Doctors, once heralded as heroes, were sometimes blamed for fueling the epidemic. Some patients fought public scorn while silently battling withdrawal. Support groups and early forms of addiction treatment began to emerge, though still rudimentary and stigmatized. The journey to recovery was long and fraught. As the Great Depression deepened economic despair, the toll of addiction grew heavier. Resources were scarce, and compassion scarcer. Yet, amid hardship, seeds of hope took root. Dedicated individuals and small organizations laid the groundwork for future change. They challenged prevailing beliefs, arguing for treatment over punishment. Their voices were the first stirrings of a movement that would take decades to mature. As the 1940s arrived, the world was engulfed in war once more, and the demand for pain relief surged again. Battlefields stretched across continents, and medical personnel faced a brutal truth: morphine remained essential, but its dangers had not disappeared. New generations of soldiers received morphine injections for wounds and surgeries. Yet, once the guns fell silent, many found themselves battling a different enemy: dependence. Back home, families grappled with loved ones who looked present but were hollowed out by addiction. The stigma and silence surrounding morphine dependency deepened the isolation. Hospitals struggled to balance compassionate care with growing awareness of addiction's grip. Simultaneously, medical research made strides. Scientists mapped how morphine altered brain chemistry, discovering receptors and pathways that explained the relentless cravings. Pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, continued to innovate, developing new opiate derivatives, believing they had learned from the past. But history repeated itself quietly. In the post-war years, as societies rebuilt, attitudes toward addiction began to slowly shift. More physicians acknowledged that addiction was a complex illness, not simply a moral failing. This growing awareness influenced early drug treatment programs, although resources were limited and approaches inconsistent. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry faced increasing scrutiny. Public health campaigns warned against misuse, yet pain management remained a delicate balancing act. Patients with legitimate needs often found themselves caught between fear of addiction and unbearable pain. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the stage was set for a new chapter in opioid history, one where science, society, and medicine would confront addiction more directly. But the scars left by decades of morphine's rise still shaped every step. The story was far from over. As the 1950s progressed, the world's understanding of addiction deepened, but the shadow of opioid dependence continued to loom large. New treatments emerged, including methadone therapy, aiming to ease withdrawal and offer hope to those trapped in cycles of use. Yet for many, the road to recovery was steep and fraught with setbacks. The stigma surrounding addiction persisted, often isolating sufferers from family, community, and care. Medical professionals struggled to balance effective pain management with the risk of dependence, a dilemma that continues even today. Pharmaceutical companies continued to innovate, developing new painkillers believed to be safer, but history warned otherwise. Throughout this time, stories of those affected by morphine and heroin, ordinary people caught in extraordinary struggles, reminded the world of the human cost behind the statistics. The legacy of morphine was a complex tapestry of hope, pain, progress, and tragedy. And as medicine moved forward, it carried with it the lessons etched by those who suffered in its name. The 1960s brought new challenges and revelations. The rise of illicit heroin use in urban centers introduced addiction to populations beyond those originally exposed through medical treatment. The distinction between patient and addict blurred in public perception, often unfairly casting a shadow over the millions suffering in silence. At the same time, advances in neuroscience unveiled more about how opioids interacted with the brain's reward systems. Scientists identified the chemical pathways responsible for craving and withdrawal, laying the groundwork for modern addiction medicine. Yet society struggled to respond with empathy. Laws hardened, criminalizing possession and use, while treatment programs remained unevenly funded and stigmatized. The war on drugs was beginning, not just a battle against substances, but against people. For many, addiction became a cycle of incarceration and relapse. Despite growing scientific understanding, compassionate care was scarce. Morphine's legacy had expanded beyond the hospital wards into streets, prisons, and families across the nation. In the midst of this turmoil, personal stories illuminated the human face of addiction. Families torn apart by dependence. Doctors haunted by patients they could not save. Communities struggling to find hope amid despair. The voices of those suffering grew louder, demanding recognition and reform. Grassroots organizations began to form, advocating for better treatment and legal reforms. Medical professionals pushed for viewing addiction as a chronic illness rather than a moral failing. Research into medications to treat dependence gained momentum. Though progress was slow, the seeds of change were sown. Yet, the road ahead remained uncertain and fraught with obstacles. Morphine's story had become intertwined with society's ongoing struggle to balance medicine, morality, and mercy. The 1970s marked a turning point in both the understanding and the public discourse surrounding opioid addiction. This decade saw the emergence of more structured treatment programs, including the wider use of methadone maintenance therapy, which offered a lifeline to many trapped in cycles of heroin and morphine dependence. However, the stigma attached to addiction remained deeply entrenched. Public policy often prioritized law enforcement over healthcare, leading to overcrowded prisons and limited access to effective treatment. At the same time, the medical community wrestled with the challenge of managing pain without contributing to addiction. Pain relief was recognized as a fundamental human right, but the tools available were imperfect. Pharmaceutical companies began developing new synthetic opiates, aiming to provide effective analgesia with reduced risk, but history warned caution. Meanwhile, stories of addiction, recovery, and relapse filled newspapers, television, and public consciousness, slowly shifting perceptions. The human cost of decades of opioid use was becoming impossible to ignore. Communities and policymakers faced difficult questions: how to balance compassion with control, treatment with prevention? Morphine's legacy was no longer confined to the past. It was a living, evolving crisis. Throughout the 1980s, the opioid crisis deepened in many parts of the world, driven by increased availability of prescription painkillers and illicit heroin. Medical research advanced rapidly, revealing the complexities of addiction as a chronic brain disease. Yet the public response often lagged behind scientific knowledge. Fear, misunderstanding, and prejudice shaped policies that too often punished rather than helped. Grassroots advocacy grew stronger, demanding better access to treatment, harm reduction strategies, and support for affected families. The decade was marked by both progress and setbacks, a tug-of-war between hope and despair. Amid this, new pharmaceuticals entered the market, promising safer pain management. But the lessons of morphine's history served as a cautionary tale, urging vigilance. As the opioid crisis unfolded, society was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about medicine, addiction, and human suffering. By the 1990s and beyond, the opioid epidemic reached new heights. Prescription opioid misuse exploded, fueled by aggressive marketing and changing attitudes toward pain. Morphine's legacy, both as a lifesaver and a destroyer, became a central part of this ongoing story. Governments, healthcare providers, and communities grappled with the scale of the crisis. Efforts to improve education, regulation, and treatment multiplied, but so did the challenges. Addiction was finally recognized as a disease requiring compassionate care, but stigma and barriers remained. The shadow cast by morphine and its derivatives stretched across generations. The story that began in a small German laboratory nearly 2 centuries ago continues to unfold. It is a story of science and society, progress and pain, hope and tragedy. And its conclusion is still unwritten. Thank you for watching this journey through the complex and often tragic history of morphine and addiction. If this story moved you or made you think differently about medicine and its consequences, please give the video a like and share it with others. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into real stories that shape our world. Your support helps us keep telling these important tales. Until next time, stay curious and take care.